Picture this. The streets of Madrid shimmer under a heavy spring sun, but instead of music or laughter, the air trembles with dread. French soldiers march through narrow alleys, their boots echoing like thunder against the ancient stones. Behind shuttered windows, ordinary Spaniards whisper, plan and pray, unaware that within hours their defiance will ignite a fire so fierce it will shake the foundations of an empire. In 1808, Spain stood on the edge of collapse. Napoleon Bonaparte, already master of most of Europe, had turned his gaze toward the Iberian Peninsula, a land fractured by politics, weakened by royal betrayal, and unprepared for the storm to come. The Spanish royal family had been manipulated, tricked into surrendering their throne under the illusion of French alliance. When French troops first crossed the Pyrenees, they were greeted not as invaders but as supposed allies. Yet soon, the truth bled through the lies. Napoleon installed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as King of Spain, and the illusion of friendship shattered overnight. Across the country, resentment simmered. Peasants, priests, merchants, people who had never picked up a weapon, now whispered of rebellion. Something ancient and unbreakable stirred beneath the fear. The people of Spain were not soldiers, but they were proud, stubborn, and deeply loyal to their homeland. What began as murmurs in the taverns and churches would soon erupt into one of Europe's fiercest resistances. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy dark history stories like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your feedback in the comments. It began quietly, almost too quietly, as all great upheavals do. In the early months of 1808, the streets of Madrid were tense but deceptively calm. French banners fluttered from balconies, the Imperatrices, royal tricolour standing stark against the fading Spanish sun. Merchants still opened their stalls, bakers still sold bread, and children still played in courtyards shadowed by French patrols. Yet beneath that fragile surface, something ancient stirred, a murmur of rage that passed from one tongue to another like a secret too dangerous to be spoken aloud. The French soldiers, confident and disciplined, walked with an arrogance that stung the locals. They believed Spain was pacified, that the proud Castilian spirit had been tamed. But behind shuttered windows and in candlelit chapels, Madrid was breathing differently. Slower, heavier, waiting. Imagine being there, a city under occupation, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear, and yet, beneath it all, the unspoken certainty that something terrible and magnificent was about to happen. The spark, they say, came on the morning of May 2nd, 1808. French troops had begun to move members of the Spanish royal family from Madrid to France, a quiet removal of any symbol of sovereignty that might inspire resistance. At dawn, word spread through the markets and churches that the last of the royal line, the young Infante Francisco, was to be taken away under guard. People began to gather near the royal palace, not as an army, but as a tide of citizens, mothers with infants in arms, blacksmiths still in aprons, old men clutching walking sticks that would soon serve as weapons. Their anger was not loud at first. It was a collective tightening of the jaw, a quiet refusal to bow. When a French officer struck a Spanish woman who tried to stop a carriage, that restraint broke. Someone shouted, no one remembered who, and the words tore through the square like thunder, "Muerte a los franceses," death to the French. What followed was chaos wrapped in courage. The crowd surged, stones flying, blades drawn, and the French line staggered under the sheer fury of untrained citizens. The uprising was not organized, nor was it strategic. It was raw, primal, and deeply human, an explosion of centuries of pride trampled by foreign boots. Picture it. Ordinary bakers swinging hammers meant for dough at armoured soldiers, seamstresses slashing at cavalry horses with scissors, priests ringing church bells not for prayer but for war. The French, stunned by the intensity of the revolt, answered with ruthless precision. Muskets cracked, sabres flashed, and soon the cobblestones were slick with blood. Still, the people did not scatter. For every Spaniard who fell, another stepped forward, shouting, "Viva España!" as though the cry itself were a weapon. By midday, the city was a battlefield. Smoke curled from burning wagons, the tolling of the bells mixed with screams, and the French command realized they faced not a mob, but a nation awakening. At the Puerta del Sol, a small group of artisans held their ground against a full regiment armed only with knives, tools, and raw defiance. Each alley became a fortress, each rooftop a sniper's perch. Imagine it, a mother shielding her child behind a fountain while loading a musket she'd never fired before, an old priest standing before a line of soldiers, crucifix raised as bullets tore through the air. The uprising had no leader, no plan, and yet it spread like wildfire, feeding on faith and fury. But here's the chilling part. The French response was swift and merciless. General Murat, Napoleon's enforcer in Spain, ordered the revolt crushed without pity. By evening, the cannons opened fire. Grapeshot tore through the narrow lanes, shattering bodies and stone alike. Those who survived were dragged into the plazas to be executed as examples. The night of May the 2nd became a nightmare, the streets of Madrid illuminated by burning homes, echoing with the cries of the condemned. Still, the spirit of resistance refused to die. Witnesses spoke of wounded men crawling to barricades to keep fighting, of women ring strips from their own skirts to bandage strangers. The uprising may have been doomed from its first cry, but it had done something extraordinary. It shattered the illusion of French control. Even as the city fell silent under curfew, the echo of defiance carried far beyond its walls. In towns across Spain, from Seville to Zaragoza, word spread that Madrid had risen. The legend of the Dos de Mayo was born, not as a military victory, but as a moral one. Ordinary Spaniards had stood against the mightiest army in Europe and made the world listen. The shock reached even Napoleon's court. How could a people so divided, so poorly armed, challenge his empire? But that was the paradox of Spain. Its weakness was its strength. The invaders saw disorganization, the locals saw unity in chaos. The French controlled the roads, the palaces, the armies. The Spaniards controlled something far more dangerous, the will to endure. As night fell, a strange quiet settled over Madrid. The dead lay where they had fallen, and the smell of smoke hung over the city like a shroud. French patrols marched through empty streets, their boots echoing hollowly against the stones. But in the dark corners the survivors whispered. They whispered names of the fallen, places of secret gatherings, and plans for revenge. The uprising had failed militarily, but it had succeeded in something deeper. It had awakened the Spanish soul, turning despair into determination. And though no one knew it yet, that single day of fury would ignite a war that would last 6 long years. A war that would bleed Napoleon's empire dry. Across the scorched plains and mountain passes, the story of Madrid's defiance spread faster than any official decree. It rode on the tongues of travelers, whispered in church pews, carried by merchants and monks alike. Soon every village in Spain knew of the day when ordinary people had risen with bare hands against the French machine. It was said that even the wind through the olive groves carried the names of the fallen, a murmur that reached farmers in their fields and shepherds in the hills. Imagine hearing it then, the rumor that the people of Madrid had bled for freedom, that resistance was no longer just a thought but a duty. In the countryside, men began to sharpen sickles meant for harvest, and women melted kitchen pots into bullets. The age of submission was over. What began as chaos now evolved into purpose. Across the rugged landscape, a new kind of war was being born, not of generals and banners, but of shadows, whispers, and vengeance. In the northern province of Asturias, an unlikely alliance took shape. Peasants, priests, and retired soldiers gathered under the moonlight, forming the first true juntas, local councils sworn to defend their homeland. These were not polished men of state. They were farmers with dirt under their nails, blacksmiths with soot-streaked faces, and clerics who prayed by day and plotted by night. The French thought themselves untouchable, but they were fighting a people who knew every inch of their land and every trick of survival. Guerrilla warfare, a term not yet common, began here. The Spaniards learned to strike like ghosts, hit and vanish, wound and disappear into the hills. A French convoy might pass through a peaceful valley at dawn and vanish by dusk, their bodies found hanging from olive trees. Imagine the fear this sowed in men who once believed themselves gods of war. And yet, the brutality was not one-sided. The French, enraged by the defiance, answered with terror. Villages suspected of aiding rebels were burned to the ground. Civilians were executed without trial, entire families erased as warnings to others. The war had descended into something darker than politics or conquest. It had become personal, almost primal. Historians later called it the People's War, but for those who lived it, it was closer to an apocalypse. Crops failed, towns starved, and still the resistance refused to die. The strength of Spain was not in its armies, but in its stubborn refusal to kneel. It was in the mother who hid a musket beneath her shawl, in the boy who guided soldiers through secret mountain paths, in the priest who buried the dead by day and carried messages by night. But here's what made it extraordinary. Even as death closed in, there was faith, not just in God, but in each other. The Spanish had rediscovered something that centuries of monarchy and corruption had buried, a sense of unity born from suffering, and suffering was everywhere. The French controlled the major cities, but the countryside belonged to no one. Convoys were ambushed, supplies stolen, and each French advance was met by invisible hands dragging them backward. By 1809, the empire's illusion of control had shattered. Imagine Napoleon sitting in his gilded study in Paris, reading report after report of lost soldiers, sabotaged lines, and vanishing battalions. Each page whispered the same truth. Spain could be conquered, but not ruled. Amid the chaos rose figures whose names would echo through history. Men like General Castaños, who rallied ragtag militias into disciplined forces and delivered one of the first major defeats to the French at the Battle of Bailén. It was unthinkable. An untrained Spanish army defeating Napoleon's veterans. Word of the victory swept through Europe like wildfire. In villages where hope had been a whisper, it became a song. If they can win, people said, then we are not doomed. The French propaganda machine scrambled to conceal the loss, but the damage was done. The myth of French invincibility had cracked. Even in Paris, murmurs grew. How could a peasant nation humiliate the empire that had humbled Austria, Prussia, and Italy? But for the Spaniards, victory came at a terrible price. Retaliati. On followed swiftly. French commanders unleashed terror campaigns, slaughtering civilians and torching entire towns. The countryside became a graveyard of unmarked memories, and yet every atrocity only deepened the resolve. Mothers taught their children to hate the invader before they could even speak his name. Rebels etched messages of defiance into church walls. They can kill our bodies, not our spirit. Imagine walking through those ruins, the smell of ash and iron lingering in the air, knowing that each stone had witnessed both horror and courage. From these ashes rose a movement that was no longer just resistance, it was transformation. The Spanish identity itself was reshaping. For centuries, loyalty had meant obedience to kings and priests. Now loyalty meant sacrifice for the people beside you. For the first time in generations, Spaniards began to see themselves not as subjects but as citizens of something sacred, their own destiny. It's strange, isn't it, how oppression can forge a freedom stronger than any law. Even modern historians point to this moment as the birth of true national consciousness in Spain. Napoleon had intended to modernize the country under his rule. Instead, he awakened a spirit that could never be tamed again. As the years passed, the war ground on. French troops marched endlessly through the same towns, conquering and reconquering ground that would not stay conquered. Roads became haunted trails of death. Villages vanished before the soldiers arrived, leaving behind empty houses and poisoned wells. Even nature seemed to rebel. Storms flooded valleys, crops failed, and wolves returned to the forests as if the land itself were reclaiming its wildness. For every French column that entered Spain, another was swallowed whole. The empire that had crushed Europe now found itself bleeding in the mountains of a country it had dismissed as backward. The irony was brutal. Napoleon's greatest weapon, fear, no longer worked here. The Spaniards had seen too much. Death to fear anything but surrender. And amid the silence of ravaged towns, a new kind of legend began to take shape. Stories of anonymous heroes, a shepherd who led 50 soldiers to their doom, a nun who smuggled gunpowder beneath her habit, a blacksmith who forged weapons by candlelight for an entire village. Most of their names were never recorded, but their deeds became the soul of the rebellion. This was not just war anymore, it was memory being written in blood. Every fallen Spaniard became part of something eternal, a story passed from father to son, whispered like a prayer before sleep. The French Empire, vast and glittering, could not comprehend such resistance. They measured victory in territory, but the Spaniards measured it in endurance. Even as the French advanced, they found only ashes, hunger, and eyes that would not bow. By 1810, the Emperor himself began to understand that Spain was not a battlefield, it was a wound that refused to close. Imagine being one of those French soldiers, once drunk on glory, now standing amid ruins, realizing that every step forward was a step deeper into a land that hated you. The drums of empire no longer inspired fear, they echoed like a funeral march. By 1811, Spain had become a nation of ghosts and warriors. The fields that once grew wheat now grew bones. The roads once filled with merchants were lined with graves. Yet somehow life persisted amid the ruins. In small villages tucked between the mountains, people still gathered at dusk to share bread and stories by the fire. Children still laughed, softly, carefully, as if even joy had to whisper under occupation. The war had taken everything but the soul, and that soul, though battered, was unbroken. Imagine the faces of those villagers lit by candlelight, eyes hollow yet defiant, knowing that every dawn might bring death, and still they prayed, still they ploughed. And what Napoleon could never understand was that this was not merely a rebellion, it was a rebirth. Every act of resistance, every bullet fired, every prayer whispered, was part of a greater awakening. Spain was becoming something new, something the Emperor's maps could not measure. By now, French dominance had begun to crumble not from battle alone, but from exhaustion, from the slow, grinding weight of a people who refused to yield. The empire stretched thin across Europe, fighting wars in Russia, Italy, and Prussia, while in Spain, its armies sank deeper into a quagmire of their own making. Even the most hardened French officers began to see the futility of it all. For every town they captured, 2 more rose in rebellion. For every partisan hanged, 10 took his place. It was like fighting the wind. The guerrillas had learned the rhythm of resistance. Strike, vanish, bleed the occupiers dry. And what's more chilling, they had learned patience. They understood that victory was not measured in days, but in the steady erosion of the enemy's will. Historians later described the Peninsular War as the bleeding ulcer of Napoleon's empire. But to the Spaniards who lived it, it was simply life. Harsh, endless, necessary. Still, the cost was unbearable. Villages were wiped from existence, entire families vanished, and famine stalked the land. The lines between good and evil blurred until only survival remained. There were moments when even the righteous grew monstrous. Spanish fighters ambushing not just soldiers but collaborators, settling old feuds beneath the cover of resistance. War, after all, is not noble. It is fire, and it consumes everything it touches. Yet even in the darkness there were sparks of humanity. French doctors who tended Spanish children, villagers who risked death to shelter wounded enemies. The war revealed both the worst and the best of what humans could be, and through it all, the question hung in the smoky air: how long could this go on? How much blood could one nation shed before it forgot why it fought? Then came the turning point, not in Madrid or Seville, but in the hearts of the people. When British forces under Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington, landed to aid the resistance, the tide began to shift. But the British were not saviours. They were witnesses to a fury they could hardly comprehend. They expected to find broken peasants. Instead, they found warriors forged in the crucible of survival. Wellesley himself wrote that the Spanish possessed a courage fierce and terrible, drawn from faith rather than discipline. Together, they began to push the French back, inch by bloody inch. Cities like Salamanca, Zaragoza, and Cadiz became symbols, not just of resistance but of resurrection. Imagine standing in those streets where every stone had been paid for with blood and realizing that the impossible was beginning to happen. The empire that had crushed Europe was retreating before a nation it had called primitive. But victory was not celebration, it was grief. When the French finally began to withdraw, they left behind a country shattered beyond recognition. Churches burned, libraries looted, homes turned to rubble. Spain had won its soul, but lost nearly everything else. And yet, the people did not despair. They rebuilt, slowly, painfully, with the same stubborn endurance that had carried them through the war. In Madrid, survivors gathered at the sites of execution and planted flowers. In villages, bells that had been silent for years rang again. The sound was not joyous, it was solemn, like a heartbeat returning after a long silence. The cost of freedom had been unimaginable, but it had been paid in full. Here's the haunting part. Even after the war ended, the wounds never truly closed. The war against Napoleon had birthed a new Spain, one aware of its power, yet fractured by trauma. The very unity forged in fire began to crack under the weight of memory. Veterans returned to find their lands gone, their families dead. The crown was restored, but the people no longer saw it with the same reverence. They had learned to fight for themselves, and once a nation learns that, it never forgets. Modern historians often call this the birth of the modern Spanish identity. Not because of glory, but because of suffering. The Spanish War of Independence became a mirror for generations to come, a reminder that even the smallest flame, when kindled by courage, can burn through empires. Imagine for a moment standing on the hills outside Madrid years later. The war is over, the air is quiet, but beneath your feet lie the bones of those who refused to bow. The city stretches before you, rebuilt yet scarred. The French banners are gone, replaced by the humble colours of a nation reborn. You hear the faint toll of a bell, calling not to battle but to remembrance. In that sound lives everything they fought for: faith, freedom, and the right to stand unbroken before the world. And as you walk away, you realise that history is not written by empires, but by the ordinary souls who dare to defy them. History often remembers emperors and generals, but it is the nameless who truly shape the world. The Uprising of 1808 was more than a rebellion. It was a promise whispered through blood and fire that no empire, no matter how mighty, can conquer the will of a free people. When ordinary Spaniards stood against Napoleon, they didn't just defend their homeland, they redefined courage itself. The echoes of their defiance still linger in the cobblestones of Madrid, in the bells of Zaragoza, in every corner where freedom once trembled and then found its voice. And perhaps that's the greatest legacy of all, that even in the darkest nights of history, humanity still finds the strength to rise. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, like the video, and tell us in the comments what type of stories you'd like to see. Because every forgotten moment of history holds another spark, waiting for someone like you to remember it.